control of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Then he was given a hearing, and if after that hearing the Attorney General decided that this person needed to be interned, he was then turned over to the care of the Army, to the jurisdiction of the United States Army. And then he would be sent to Fort Meade, Maryland. And that's where this basic personnel record was generated. And then they sent him to other camps for reasons we're still not sure of. Yeah. So many of those internees who went to Fort Meade were then sent to McAlester, Oklahoma, to another internment camp. And then they were sent to still another camp in Tennessee or Fort Sam Houston in Texas. And on the West Coast, they went a different route. They went to Angel Island first, which was an Army base, Camp McDowell, and then they would be sent to Fort Sam Houston and then to McAlester. Then in 1943, the Army decided that although it had insisted that it was the only one that could control these people, these dangerous enemy aliens as they were called, in 1943 the Army decided it already had too much to handle, and it's now said, okay, we're going to give the control of the enemy aliens back to the Immigration and Naturalization Service, and that's when all the Italian aliens went back to Fort Missoula, Montana. The Germans were sent basically to Bismarck, North Dakota, to Fort Lincoln up there.
Bismarck.
Bismarck, right. So what we kept thinking was that the enemy aliens had been sent immediately to Fort Missoula, Montana. That really wasn't the way it was supposed to go. They were supposed to be turned over to the Army, and then only in 43 were they all sent to Missoula.
Hearing you talk about this sounds familiar. I mean, we're hearing about, it seems like history is repeating itself. I mean, these days with Arab Americans or, you know, since 9/11, it just sounds like the story is repeating itself.
Well, it is in more ways than one, in fact, because one of the salient facts about the people who were interned, as well as there was another program that the Army called exclusion, which affected naturalized citizens. You see, most of the programs that we're talking about with respect to the Italian Americans were programs that affected only non-citizens, so-called enemy aliens. 600,000 of those throughout the country.
Really?
Yes.
That's a lot. And this is 1940?
This is 1940, 41 and 2.
Okay.
So, the people who were picked up to be interned were never charged with anything. That is to say, they could have legal advice, although their lawyers couldn't say anything at these hearings. They could just advise their clients. Most of them didn't have lawyers because they were Italian speaking and they could hardly defend themselves. But the ones that did have lawyers, like Ezio Pinza, for example, who was the first bass at the Metropolitan Opera and then became the star of South Pacific, he did have a lawyer. The problem was the lawyer was not told what the charges were, because in fact there were no charges against many of them. They were just put on these, what was called a custodial detention list, because of suspicions on the part of the government. Either they were active in the Italian American community, or they were journalists, or someone had turned the person in. So they were never told the charges against them. And they were given this hearing, and what they were expected to do was to prove their innocence in the absence of any charges. Well, that's exactly what's happening today. People are arrested, they're not told the charges against them, they're just put in camps or Guantanamo Bay or wherever they're put, and they're never told the charges against them. So that's one very strong similarity. The other one is that those people that I mentioned earlier, the excludees, these were naturalized citizens who were also considered to be dangerous. There were a couple of dozen of them from San Francisco who were...
Or Joe DiMaggio's family was considered...
Well, Joe DiMaggio's family was under restriction. His father and mother were both enemy aliens. So his father couldn't go to the San Francisco wharf where he fished.
That's incredible.
But he was not one of these excludees. But my point about the excludees is that they were given hearings before a 3-man military tribunal.
A secret tribunal.
Which also was illegal because U.S. citizens are not supposed to come under the jurisdiction of the military, except if the courts are not operating. Nonetheless, they were given hearings before a military tribunal, and if the military tribunal decided they were dangerous, they were excluded from vast military zones.
Americans of Italian heritage have not wanted to talk about this, but there's now, I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but there's an act of Congress, November 2000, called the Wartime Violations of Italian American Civil Liberties Act.
That's right.
Which is amazing. It's just incredible that it ever got passed. How many people were behind that act to get that through Congress?
Well, essentially, I worked with a man named John Calvelli, who was the aide or administrative chief to Congressman Elliot Engel. Mm-hmm. And John Calvelli is an activist in the East Coast, in the Italian American community. And he called me and said, we at the National Italian American Foundation would like to propose some legislation and see if we can get it passed. So I gave him a bunch of facts, some of the things that we would like to know. For example, at that time, all this material that I've just told you about internees, we didn't know any of that. Right. So that was one of the things I wanted to find out. Wanted to find out about the fishermen and what other ports were affected. We found out that Boston was one of them. So Calvelli wrote up this legislation. We introduced it into the Congress. I went back to Washington a couple of times. It then had to be reintroduced in the next session of Congress. I think the first time it was introduced was 1997. Mm-hmm. Didn't pass that session. Was reintroduced into the 1998 Congress, right. The 106th Congress, I believe that was. And we got to the point where we had about 80 Congress persons who were co-sponsors. Really? Calvelli said, we need at least 100 to bring it to the floor, and what we really would like to have is Judiciary Committee hearings, because that'll really put us over the top. Mm-hmm. As luck would have it, a guy from Chicago who read about this when our exhibit was in Chicago, read a column that had been written by a columnist for the Sun-Times, I believe, called me and said, I'm outraged about this. I've never heard this before. What can I do to help? I said, you're from Chicago. Congressman Henry Hyde is from Chicago as well. If you can get Henry Hyde to hold Judiciary Committee hearings, you will be doing a terrific service. Well, Tony LaPiana went into Henry Hyde's office and wouldn't give up, and finally persuaded him, with some work in Washington as well, and some work from Italian American organizations throughout the country, people writing letters and stuff. Right. Persuaded him to hold Judiciary Committee hearings. Mm-hmm. And those hearings were held in October of 1999 and were really the turning point. I see. We had Doris Pinza, who was Ezio Pinza's wife, was there, told his story. Mm-hmm. Dom DiMaggio was there. Mm-hmm. And I was there, and several other people were there. Mm-hmm.
The effects of what happened, the internment, nothing compared to what the Japanese went through in many ways, but it left a stigma on a lot of Italian Americans. And I was reading in your book, someone had talked about, I don't know if it was Jeffrey Dunn, in one of the chapters, talked about the cultural genocide in Italian American communities across the country. Was this an exaggeration, or what kind of an effect has it had in the long run?
Well, cultural genocide is a pretty strong term. I'm not sure I would use that term. World War II was definitely a watershed for Italian Americans. Mm-hmm. There had been lots of prejudice and discrimination from the time they had emigrated in the early 1900s, late 1800s, all the way up to World War II. But they were starting to really get their community together, in fact. And there were even writers. I have an essay in the book called How World War II Iced Italian American Culture. Mm-hmm. There were writers who were becoming famous. Jerry Mangione, John Fante was becoming a very well-known novelist, and a number of others. World War II put a chill on all that because first of all, it put an inhibition on speaking the Italian language.